Mrs. Varden expressed her sympathy for her daughter's distress by scolding her roundly for being so late, and the honest locksmith divided himself between condoling with and kissing Dolly, and shaking hands heartily with Joe, whom he could not sufficiently praise or thank. In reference to this latter point, old John was far from agreeing with his friend, for besides that he by no means approved of an adventurous spirit in the abstract, it occurred to him that if his son and heir had been seriously damaged in a scuffle, the consequences would assuredly have been expensive and inconvenient, and might perhaps have proved detrimental to the Maypole business. Wherefore, and because he looked with no favourable eye upon young girls, but rather considered that they and the whole female sex were a kind of nonsensical mistake on the part of nature, he took occasion to retire and shake his head in private at the boiler, inspired by which silent oracle he was moved to give Joe various stealthy nudges with his elbow, as a parental reproof and gentle admonition to mind his own business and not make a fool of himself. Joe, however, took down the lantern and lighted it, and arming himself with a stout stick, asked whether Hugh was in the stable. "He's lying asleep before the kitchen fire, sir," said Mr. Willet. "What do you want him for?" "I want him to come with me to look after this bracelet and letter," answered Joe. "Hulloa there, Hugh!" Dolly turned pale as death, and felt as if she must faint forthwith. After a few moments Hugh came staggering in, stretching himself and yawning according to custom, and presenting every appearance of having been roused from a sound nap. "Here, sleepy-head," said Joe, giving him the lantern. "Carry this, and bring the dog and that small cudgel of yours, and woe betide the fellow if we come upon him." "What fellow?" growled Hugh, rubbing his eyes and shaking himself. "What fellow?" returned Joe, who was in a state of great valour and bustle. "A fellow you ought to know of and be more alive about. It's well for the like of you, lazy giant that you are, to be snoring your time away in chimney corners, when honest men's daughters can't cross even our quiet meadows at nightfall without being set upon by footpads and frightened out of their precious lives." "They never rob me," cried Hugh with a laugh. "I have got nothing to lose. But I'd as lief knock them at head as any other men. How many are there?" "Only one," said Dolly faintly, for everybody looked at her. "And what was he like, mistress?" said Hugh, with a glance at young Willet so slight and momentary that the scowl it conveyed was lost on all but her. "About my height?" "Not so tall," Dolly replied, scarce knowing what she said. "His dress," said Hugh, looking at her keenly, "like any of ours, now? I know all the people hereabouts, and maybe could give a guess at the man if I had anything to guide me." Dolly faltered and turned paler yet, then answered that he was wrapped in a loose coat and had his face hidden by a handkerchief, and that she could give no other description of him. "You wouldn't know him if you saw him then, belike?" said Hugh with a malicious grin. "I should not," answered Dolly, bursting into tears again. "I don't wish to see him. I can't bear to think of him. I can't talk about him any more. Don't go to look for these things, Mr. Joe. Pray don't. I entreat you not to go with that man." "Not to go with me?" cried Hugh. "I'm too rough for them all. They're all afraid of me. Why, bless you, mistress, I've the tenderest heart alive. I love all the ladies, ma'am," said Hugh, turning to the locksmith's wife. Mrs. Varden opined that if he did he ought to be ashamed of himself, such sentiments being more consistent, so she argued, with a benighted Mussulman or wild islander than with a staunch Protestant. Arguing from this imperfect state of his morals, Mrs. Varden further opined that he had never studied the manual. Hugh admitting that he never had, and moreover that he couldn't read, Mrs. Varden declared with much severity that he ought to be even more ashamed of himself than before, and strongly recommended him to save up his pocket money for the purchase of one, and further to teach himself the contents with all convenient diligence. She was still pursuing this train of discourse when Hugh, somewhat unceremoniously and irreverently, followed his young master out, and left her to edify the rest of the company. This she proceeded to do, and finding that Mr. Willet's eyes were fixed upon her with an appearance of deep attention, gradually addressed the whole of her discourse to him, whom she entertained with a moral and theological lecture of considerable length, in the conviction that great workings were taking place in his spirit. The simple truth was, however, that Mr. Willet, although his eyes were wide open and he saw a woman before him whose head, by long and steady looking at, seemed to grow bigger and bigger until it filled the whole bar, was, to all other intents and purposes, fast asleep, and so sat leaning back in his chair with his hands in his pockets until his son's return caused him to wake up with a deep sigh, and a faint impression that he had been dreaming about pickled pork and greens, a vision of his slumbers which was no doubt referable to the circumstance of Mrs. Varden's having frequently pronounced the word "grace" with much emphasis, which word, entering the portals of Mr. Willet's brain as they stood ajar, and coupling itself with the words "before meat," which were there ranging about, did in time suggest a particular kind of meat, together with that description of vegetable which is usually its companion. The search was wholly unsuccessful. Joe had groped along the path a dozen times, and among the grass, and in the dry ditch, and in the hedge, but all in vain. Dolly, who was quite inconsolable for her loss, wrote a note to Miss Haredale, giving her the same account of it that she had given at the Maypole, which Joe undertook to deliver as soon as the family were stirring next day. That done, they sat down to tea in the bar, where there was an uncommon display of buttered toast, and, in order that they might not grow faint for want of sustenance, and might have a decent halting place or halfway house between dinner and supper, a few savoury trifles in the shape of great rashers of broiled ham, which, being well cured, done to a turn, and smoking hot, sent forth a tempting and delicious fragrance. Mrs. Varden was seldom very Protestant at meals, unless it happened that they were underdone or overdone, or indeed that anything occurred to put her out of humour. Her spirits rose considerably on beholding these goodly preparations, and from the nothingness of good works she passed to the somethingness of ham and toast with great cheerfulness. Nay, under the influence of these wholesome stimulants, she sharply reproved her daughter for being low and despondent, which she considered an unacceptable frame of mind, and remarked, as she held her own plate for a fresh supply, that it would be well for Dolly, who pined over the loss of a toy and a sheet of paper, if she would reflect upon the voluntary sacrifices of the missionaries in foreign parts who lived chiefly on salads. The proceedings of such a day occasioned various fluctuations in the human thermometer, and especially in instruments so sensitively and delicately constructed as Mrs. Varden. Thus at dinner Mrs. V. stood at summer heat, genial, smiling, and delightful. After dinner, in the sunshine of the wine, she went up at least half a dozen degrees, and was perfectly enchanting. As its effect subsided she fell rapidly, went to sleep for an hour or so at temperate, and woke at something below freezing. Now she was at summer heat again, in the shade, and when tea was over, and old John, producing a bottle of cordial from one of the oaken cases, insisted on her sipping 2 glasses thereof in slow succession, she stood steadily at 90 for 1 hour and a quarter. Profiting by experience, the locksmith took advantage of this genial weather to smoke his pipe in the porch, and in consequence of this prudent management he was fully prepared, when the glass went down again, to start homewards directly. The horse was accordingly put in, and the chaise brought round to the door. Joe, who would on no account be dissuaded from escorting them until they had passed the most dreary and solitary part of the road, led out the grey mare at the same time, and having helped Dolly into her seat, more happiness, sprung gaily into the saddle. Then, after many good nights, and admonitions to wrap up, and glancing of lights, and handing in of cloaks and shawls, the chaise rolled away, and Joe trotted beside it, on Dolly's side, no doubt, and pretty close to the wheel too. Chapter 21